Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. 30 seconds over Tokyo. If those words ring a bell, then you know I'm referring to James Doolittle and the bombing raid he led over Tokyo 80 years ago on April 18th, 1942. It was the first time in World War II, 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that the United States was able to take the fight to the enemy's homeland. And today, I'd like to share some thoughts on not only what the Doolittle raid meant 80 years ago, but also what it can mean to us and the younger generation of today as well. Those of us who grew up in the decades after World War II have always known the United States as having the strongest, most powerful military in the world. But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the United States at the time had at best probably the third most powerful military in the world behind Germany and Japan. In fact, in 1941, there were only about 180,000 men in the U.S. Army, making it the 19th largest army in the world behind Portugal. And in the months following Pearl Harbor, the United States suffered humiliating defeat after defeat in the Pacific. There was the fall of the Philippines and the infamous Bataan Death March. America at the time had no way to fight back and take the fight directly to the enemy. That was until a Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle came up with a bold plan to launch an air raid on Tokyo. Now, to appreciate just how bold and daring this plan was, we must remember that the U.S. in 1942 didn't have carrier-based fighter planes and bombers capable of projecting power anywhere in the world. Doolittle had to instead rely on land-based B-25 bombers that normally need about 700 foot of runway and train his pilots to take off on just 425 feet of runway from an aircraft carrier. And to make the mission even more dangerous, it was a one-way flight, meaning they wouldn't be able to return to their carrier after their mission. They instead, once they finished bombing, had to fly through Japanese-occupied China and land on an airfield that was not yet under Japanese control. But even this didn't go quite as planned, because on the morning of April 18th, 1942, a Japanese fishing boat was spotted near the carrier USS Hornet. Fearing that the Japanese crew might notify Japan about their existence, Doolittle and his men decided to launch their bombers earlier than anticipated. So rather than waiting until they were about 400 miles from Japan, they now decided to launch the mission about 200 miles further out. This meant they would most likely run out of fuel before they could reach their bases in China. James Doolittle gave his men every opportunity to back out of this dangerous mission, but not one of the 80 men who volunteered for this mission backed out. So, on the morning of April 18th, 1942, 80 airmen boarded 16 B-25 bombers and took off from the carrier USS Hornet en route to Tokyo, Japan. Each plane dropped 4 bombs and flew for only about 30 seconds over the city. They targeted factories and other military targets while deliberately avoiding bombing the Emperor's palace. In terms of military significance, the damage caused by the Doolittle raid was minor and would pale in comparison to future bombing raids to come. But it gave a huge psychological and morale boost to Americans. The Japanese government had promised their people that their islands could never be touched by foreign invaders. The Doolittle raid was a shock to the Japanese people, and it forced them to divert military resources to protecting their homeland. The raid also boosted the morale of America's allies in China. For 10 years, China had been brutally invaded and occupied by the Japanese army with a barbarity beyond belief. And just as brave as the American pilots were the hundreds of Chinese villagers and doctors who put themselves in great danger by helping to rescue the pilots after they crash landed in China. Many Chinese risked their lives by rescuing, hiding, and carrying the pilots to safety. And sadly though, over 200,000 Chinese were later slaughtered by the Japanese army in revenge for helping the pilots. World War II was a time when Americans and their Chinese allies sacrificed and fought together for a common cause. And that's something young people today should probably be aware of given the current tensions between the two countries. In addition, it's now been over 80 years since the Doolittle raid. Pretty much a lifetime. All of Doolittle's men, along with pretty much everyone who fought in World War II, are pretty much all gone now. This is significant because in the decades following World War II, the people who fought in the war were always around to lead us from their experience. It was easy to assume that future generations will remember their lessons and never repeat the same mistakes of the 1930s that led the world to war. But when we look at the world today and see what's going on between countries, we can no longer be too sure about that. Today, two former enemies, Japan and Germany, are now close allies. But a lot of the same tensions, resentments, and territorial ambitions between countries that existed right before the outbreak of World War II seem to be rising again today, just with different countries. And what if the next generation does have to face a new global conflict? Will they be ready? If it should come to that, perhaps the story of James Doolittle and all the men who fought in World War II can still serve as an example of how to serve with discipline and courage in the face of great fear and danger. One of Doolittle's raiders, Ted Lawson, wrote a book called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, in which he tells about his experience as one of the pilots in the Doolittle raid. Ted Lawson himself had his face smashed, and he lost his leg when he crash landed in China. And he also lost 11 of his fellow friends and airmen during the raid. Towards the end of the book, he talks about whether or not it was worth it. Here's what he wrote. "You think it was worthwhile?" one of the boys asked me before he went to sleep that early morning of June 4th. I thought it over for a while, trying to see the whole thing objectively. When I finally said that I did, I meant it. We'll probably never know just how much damage we caused. The important thing, I figured, was that our people got a lift out of it. It made them sure that we could go to work on the Japs, no matter how far away they were. I hadn't thought much about our people before that night. A fellow doesn't volunteer for something like the Japan raid, bomb the place, try to get away, and in my case, lose a leg and say, "This is for the dear people." You just don't say or openly feel those things. You think about yourself most of the time, whether you'll have the guts enough to go through with the thing, and whether you'll get away with it. It's only later, when you add up things and get the sum, that you think of the people and the cause. And then you hope you've done both of them some good. Reading these words gives us perspectives and helps me understand how the sacrifices of men from a lifetime ago created the world we live in today. And whether or not we can maintain this world, make it better, or repeat mistakes of the past, depend on whether or not we remember what the generations before us tried to teach us. And that's why those 30 Seconds Over Tokyo 80 years ago can still teach us important lessons today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.